December 23, 2001. Buenos Aires. Ana Maria Torres opens her shop and walks to the bank. She has customers. She has inventory. She has pesos in the account. What she does not have is access. The withdrawals are frozen. Her business is still alive on paper. In practice, it has already been cut off from oxygen. The order has a name, corralito. This is not fiction. This was Argentina, 2001. And here is the part that matters. The worker did not forget how to work. The shopkeeper did not forget how to sell. The salaried employee did not suddenly become useless. The break happened somewhere colder. Inside settlement, under Decree 1570-2001, Argentina limited cash withdrawals to 250 pesos or dollars per week. Not per need, per rule. The account still existed. The balance still existed. But the bridge between claim and cash had been narrowed by decree, and by December 23, Fernando de la Rua was already gone, forced out after the uprising of December 19 and 20. The political system had cracked before most people had even processed what had happened to their money. That is the thesis of this entire video. A job can survive. A bank balance can survive. A salary can survive. And still stop being money. Sofieri, reporting from Buenos Aires for The Guardian on December 23, 2001, quoted Ricardo Martinez, a 41-year-old who had mortgaged his house for a $20,000 loan to set up a market stall. He had not stopped working. He had not opted out. He had done what the system tells you to do. Build, borrow, continue. And there he was, saying he was going to lose everything. Not because effort vanished, because convertibility did. And once you see that, Argentina stops looking like a local disaster. It starts looking like a pattern. August 15, 1971, Richard Nixon goes on television and tells the country he has directed Treasury Secretary John Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets. That line is usually remembered as a geopolitical event, a monetary summit, a president closing the gold window. All true. And still too abstract, because the real forensic point is lower down. When redemption changes at the top of a system, every promise underneath changes character, not all at once, not always visibly, but decisively. Under Bretton Woods, foreign monetary authorities could still treat the dollar as a claim with a defined official conversion linked to gold. After August 15, that rule was suspended. The number printed on the contract did not vanish. The legal environment around the contract did, and that is how systems fail without looking broken on day one. Your wage can still arrive. Your bank balance can still display. Your bond can still mature at par. But the thing backing the chain of promises is no longer the same thing. History Office summaries and Federal Reserve history both describe August 1971 as the beginning of the end of Bretton Woods. Not because paper notes disappeared, because the settlement promise above them changed. Foreign exchange markets closed for days, while governments tried to work out what the dollar now was. In practical terms, after the old redemption rule was broken, this is the part most people miss. They imagine monetary regimes die when shops are empty and prices explode. But first, much earlier, the definition of the claim changes. Quietly. In legal language, in central bank windows, in eligibility rules, in who is still allowed to redeem, and for what. Nixon himself presented the move as a defense against speculators, and as a technical action in the national interest. That is how these terms are usually sold. Temporary, technical, necessary. But if you live below that layer, the issue was not the speech. It was the signal. If the reserve asset of the system can change character by executive decision, then every lower promise becomes more political than it looked the day before. Your contract still has numbers. It has less anchor. Your salary still exists. It has less definition. Your savings instrument still says dollar. But dollar now means something more discretionary than the public was used to imagining. Not fake. Worse. Conditional. And once you understand that, Argentina in 2001 stops looking like an exception. It starts looking like a descendant. Here's the next layer of the pattern. Sometimes the system does not trap your money. It delays it or replaces it. And the effect can be almost the same. In Russia through the 1990s, wage arrears became a defining feature of economic life. Not unemployment first. Arrears. The employer still existed. The factory gate still opened. The worker still reported for duty. But payment drifted from wage into promise. An EZA study on Russian wage arrears says the problem became substantial in 1993. And by the beginning of 1998, the aggregate stock of overdue wages had reached 50 trillion rubles, citing Goskomstat. It also reports that by the end of 1998, nearly two-thirds of Russian employees said they were owed overdue wages, with average debt equal to 4-8 monthly wages. Think about what that means at street level. You are still employed. You are still compliant. You are still earning. But the thing called earnings has moved out of the present and into a queue. The IMF noted that Goskomstat was already reporting wage arrears measures from April 1, 1992. This was not rumor. It was visible in the record early, and World Bank work on transition economies described the coverage of wage arrears in Eurasian countries as staggering, noting that 40% of Russian workers experienced wage arrears in 1996. That is one way a paycheck stops being money. Now the Argentine version. In 2001 and 2002, as orderly financing sources closed, the federal government and provinces began issuing quasi-monies to finance expenditures. The IMF calls them exactly that, quasi-monies. Patacones, laycops. Claims designed to keep the machine moving when normal funding and normal money were no longer enough. This is the buried psychological break. At first glance, replacement paper can look like adaptation. And sometimes it is. Shops stay open. Salaries get paid in some form. Local trade continues. But then you find out that not every claim clears equally. One note is accepted everywhere, another only with a discount. One pays taxes. Another buys food only if the shopkeeper is desperate. The government says you have been paid. The market says, not fully. And that is the connection between Russia and Argentina. In Russia, time degraded the wage. In Argentina, quality degraded the wage. Different route. Same forensic result. The job survives. The salary survives. The worker does not receive full present tense money. And once a society accepts that distinction, it has already crossed into a different monetary order. Weimar is usually told as a story about prices, wheelbarrows, meanies, rewritten by the hour, banknotes with impossible zeros, all true, but not yet precise enough, because some professions did not die when domestic demand disappeared. They died when foreign settlement broke, when imported inputs, coal, chemicals, metals, spare parts, and invoices tied to external payments stopped matching the currency in which German wages and domestic sales were being recorded. That is the mechanism. Not just inflation. Settlement fracture across borders. Costantino Bresciani Tironi's classic study of the German inflation tracks the collapse in the foreign exchange value of the mark and shows why foreign trade became such a brutal pressure point. A domestic seller could still sell. A domestic worker could still work. But if the next shipment had to be paid through a currency that was disintegrating against external money, effort at home no longer repaired the break. This is where people get the story wrong. They imagine hyperinflation means money stops buying local goods, but before that final humiliation, it stops performing a more technical task. It stops coordinating with the outside world. Import invoices become a countdown. Credit terms shorten. Foreign suppliers demand protection against the next exchange move. Domestic labor remains real. Domestic books remain nominal. The external unit of account becomes the executioner. And that means a merchant can be operating while already finished. The shop is open. The orders are written down. The staff still come in. But the replacement inventory will not clear. That is a different kind of death. Slower to photograph, easier to deny, and much closer to modern reality than the wheelbarrow cliché. Because if your system depends on imported energy, imported components, imported medicine, or foreign currency liabilities, then your profession is not secured by domestic activity alone. It is secured by an external settlement channel you do not control. Once that breaks, your productivity is still real. Your revenue may still be real. Your unit of account is not. September 15, 2008. Lehman Brothers files for Chapter 11. That date is often told as a morality play about excess. Too much leverage. Too much real estate. Too much denial. All true, but still incomplete, because the lethal event was not simply that Lehman had become a bad business. It was that the firm lost the funding and clearing confidence required to keep functioning from one day to the next. The Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission's account shows how central that dependency was in the days before the filing, including pressure through tri-party repo and escalating demands from J.P. Morgan, Lehman's clearing bank. This is the distinction that matters. A company can survive losses for a while. It cannot survive failed settlement. On September 4, 2008, Lehman told J.P. Morgan to expect a $3.9 billion third-quarter loss. In the days that followed, the firm's position deteriorated into a race against withdrawal, collateral, and confidence. By the weekend of September 13-14, rescue talks with Barclays and Bank of America had collapsed, and the bankruptcy filing was prepared before markets opened on Monday. And when that chain snapped, it did not hit only shareholders. Reuters later described roughly 26,000 Lehman employees losing their jobs. The people inside that machine were not all reckless traders. They included operations staff, assistants, analysts, compliance staff, technologists, support workers, people whose real function depended on a legal and funding architecture they did not control. One former employee, Darren Kimball, described seeing his 26,000 colleagues lose their jobs after the collapse. That is why Lehman belongs in this story. It proves that modern pay can fail even at elite institutions, and fail fast. Your desk still exists on Friday. Your title still exists on Friday. Your deferred compensation still exists on Friday. By Monday, the clearing chain is gone, and once clearing access disappears, a whole professional ecosystem discovers the same thing Ana Maria Torres discovered in Buenos Aires. Paper survival is not functional survival. Not at a bank, not at a ministry, not at a shop. Anywhere. Now take the modern parallel. Venezuela did not need to abolish work to destroy the meaning of wages. The office could remain. The ministry could remain. The title could remain. And the IMF now describes the country's collapse in exactly those terms. A historic humanitarian crisis tied to economic breakdown and mass migration. That matters because it tells you what failed first. Not human capacity. Not the willingness to work. The clearing power of the income. So when you hear that someone is still employed, you should ask a harder question. Employed in what unit? Paid into what claim? Redeemable where? For how long? Because a salary is only real in proportion to what it can still command. Food, transport, rent, medicine, exit. If those move out of reach, the paycheck still exists in law. It has stopped working in life. That is the hierarchy the forensic record keeps forcing on you. First, cash you can touch. Then foreign exchange you can settle with. Then essentials already in hand. Then skills another person will still pay for directly. Everything else is downstream of institutional promises, and institutions change the rules. Sometimes by decree, as in Argentina. Sometimes by convertibility, as in 1971. Sometimes by arrears, sometimes by bankruptcy court, sometimes by replacement paper passed off as continuity. So the choice is not optimism versus pessimism. It is clarity versus dependence. You can build your life around titles, balances, and salary lines that only function while institutions honor them exactly as expected. Or you can build around claims, tools, reserves, and enforceable skills that still clear when those promises change. That is the whole record. Not all jobs die in a crisis, but many paychecks do.